All right, good evening, everybody. You might take your Bibles and let's go to Matthew 16. I think that'll be the place for us to start. It's in some cases, it's easier to go to Matthew because he has more of the narrative in one place, and in some places, maybe Mark or Luke. But I think for the most part, we can stay with Matthew's account tonight. We will go over to Mark for at least one account, and then we'll come back to Matthew. And certainly, if you see something in one of the other accounts that would help clarify or parallel with something, then feel free to share that with us, and we'll make note of that along the way. My PowerPoint's not fitting on my screen. I think Mr. Bonnie and me are having the same problem. We got this new projector, and we had it lined up just right, but something changed, and so we're going to have to climb up there and do something about it. But maybe you can see what I got going on up there anyway. So we are in this period of the life of Jesus that's called the retirement. So chronologically, we're a little bit close. We're a little bit over halfway, I would say, in the ministry of Jesus. But textually, it kind of does fall right in the middle of things, especially like in the book of Mark, and I'll make a couple of points about that tonight. So Mark 8, it's 16 chapters, so right in the middle. A little earlier in Luke spends a lot more time from the closing ministry on, as we'll see later this quarter. But right in the middle in some ways, and this is tonight is an important set of text. We go into what is called the fourth retirement, and so we have four retirements that we've looked at. The first retirement, the major thing would have been the feeding of the 5,000. Then we have the second and third retirements, and we've got like the Syrophoenician woman and the feeding of the 4,000. And this one is what we're going to refer to as the fourth retirement. And the events, there are significant events in this period, but I would say that probably the biggest thing about this period is some of the conversation that happens during this, and we'll try to take a look at that tonight. Anything you want to say as far as leading up to what we've been looking at, or anything like that?
No, the conversation, I think, especially with the disciples in this section tends to get a lot more personal and a lot more,
Yes, that's exactly right.
kind of narrowing it down to his death and things. So it becomes to get a lot more intimate with them as far as the conversation.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so last time in verse 39 of chapter 15, we left off that they came to the region of Magadan, and this map doesn't have Magadan, but if you look at Mark's account, it'll mention Dalmanutha, and if you look up Magadan, it's right there in this same area. So this is the region of Magadan and the city of Dalmanutha right there, and that's where they go, and that's where the questions are raised, or where they ask for a sign. And Jesus says, no sign's going to be given to you except the sign of Jonah. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about that the other night, but you have already talked about the sign of Jonah in the book of Matthew. I think Jesus is making another reference to it here. It was already mentioned in Matthew chapter 12, and then he also gives the sign of Jonah in Matthew 12, and then he repeats that here in Matthew 16. And I think what Jesus is saying is, I'm not going to give you another sign. Enough has already been given. And he makes reference to Jonah. And what does the sign of Jonah point toward? His death and resurrection. Yeah. So I think in Jonah, we see not a literal death, but a figurative death, right? And when Jonah, he has that prayer inside the fish's belly, he basically prays as though he's dead, right? And so the fact that he in 3 days is brought back to life, that he has given you life, then Jesus is able to make reference to that and say, that's a sign that's pointing to me. I am quite sure they didn't understand that in Matthew 12. I'm certain they didn't pick up on it in Matthew 16. But I think that's Jesus' point, is that they're able to look around and they're able to see the weather patterns, but they can't see what's right in front of them. His signs, combined with what the Old Testament scriptures are pointing to, they should have been able to put all that together and have read the times, right? Have read the skies about what was happening, and they weren't able to do that. And so that's going to kind of lead to the next section. Did you have something you wanted to say about this? So I think we kind of ran out of time a little bit the other night, and I wanted to make sure we got that. So they're going to leave from Dalmanutha. Notice this in verse 5. They're going to go to the other side of the sea, and they're going to have a conversation on the way. And we'll read this. And would you rather take this section or?
That's fine.
Okay, go ahead.
Verse 5, it says, "And the disciples came to the other side and forgot to take bread. And Jesus said unto them, Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, We took no bread. And Jesus, perceiving it, said, O ye of little faith, why reason ye among yourselves, because ye have no bread? Do you not yet perceive, neither remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000, how many baskets you took up?" I said biscuit. Baskets you took up. Neither the 7 loaves of the 4,000, and how many baskets you took up. How is it that you do not perceive that I spake not to you concerning bread, but beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Then understood they that he bade them not beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teachings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So this word leaven is going to be used several times here. We're going to find it several times throughout New Testament. It was used in Matthew 13. It's going to be used in Galatians chapter 5. And in most cases, especially biblically, it's kind of used as a term for corrupt. You know, what leaven is a substance that's used to change or transform. And so leaven can be good. It all depends on the intent of the user. So I think we're actually called to be leaven in the world, to change and transform the world around us. But here he's talking about the false teachings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And then in verse 8, we see this phrase again that just keeps popping up with the disciples. What phrase is that? Oh, ye of little faith. It seems like just about every story that we've read these few weeks, that phrase has popped up of, oh, ye of little faith. That's what he said to Peter when he was walking on the water. I think about Peter. He's got to be like tired of hearing this. It's this, oh, ye of little faith. But once again, they seem to have forgotten the things that had just took place: the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000. And he's kind of hitting on that, but then it kind of like a light bulb goes off, and they kind of realize this is not even about physical bread. This is about, the teaching of the Pharisees, the false doctrines, the traditions that they were trying to force. That's what this was all about. It's not even about literal bread that he's talking about.
Yeah. So I want you to notice, if you will, whose leaven are we talking about? Who does he point to? The Pharisees and the Sadducees in Matthew's account. Anybody remember what Mark's account says? So he references the leaven of Herod as well. I'm not exactly sure if Sadducees and Herod would have been parallel terms. I'm wondering if maybe not all three were part of the conversation. I would certainly say this: the Pharisees were much less supportive of the Herodian government than the Sadducees would have been. The Sadducees kind of bought into Roman power, and Herod was the Roman representative. And so it may very well be that that's a parallel conversation. But here's the interesting thing. What normally would have been going on with the Pharisees and Sadducees? They would have been in conflict, that's right. But now you've got the two of them working together in trying to detract from Jesus. And so Jesus kind of groups them all together and says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They're kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum, but when it comes to Jesus, there's danger from both of them, and we'll certainly see this later on in the gospel account, that they're going to unite in their opposition against Jesus. And of course, their influence here is what's being concerned. Now what do you notice about, what's strange about the disciples in this? That's exactly right. They've already seen a miracle performed, not just once, but twice, and provision for more than 12. But now we're looking at numbers like 20,000 people, probably like 5 plus women and children, 4 plus women and children. We're talking about thousands of people that have been provided for. And it's interesting, they say, we didn't bring bread, but I believe that it's in Mark 8's account. It says, well, I was thinking one of them talked about, they didn't have more than 1 loaf in the boat with them, right? So they actually do have some bread with them, just not enough. Well, they've not had enough on 2 major occasions, and Jesus has been able to provide. One thing I want to note here is I wonder what's going on with the disciples here. They see the power of Jesus, but I think they have a hard time drawing the conclusion about its application in that he can always make provision along the way. And I think it just shows maybe they're kind of like the people in John 6 who see the bread, but they don't see what the bread is pointing to. And in this case, they think Jesus is talking about literal physical bread, and he's talking about influence. And Jesus is actually, at this point, as long as he's been with them, right? We're talking about probably 2 years in the ministry with them. And this is still where they're thinking about the bread. I think we hear more of Jesus' frustration in this moment than we probably do leading up to this. In fact, it's in Mark's account, he quotes from Isaiah and says, do you not perceive or understand? Have you no heart and heart? Verse 18 of Mark 8, having eyes do you not see, and having ears do you not hear? And that comes from Isaiah chapter 6, where God told Isaiah that he was going to go and preach, and the people weren't going to listen, and the people weren't going to pay attention. And Jesus is asking them, you're not falling into that category, are you? Which should have kind of shocked them, should have kind of provoked them to think that Jesus is saying, hey, you don't want to be the people who are listening but don't understand, who are hearing but don't understand, and seeing but don't perceive. So that they do understand that. They don't want to be influenced by the Pharisees and Sadducees. And then they're going to come into, and I may mention this just a second ago, they're going to come across from Dalmanutha, and they're going to come back to Bethsaida. Bethsaida, name that means house of fish. So they had a conversation about bread, and now they're coming to the house of fish. So kind of a common thing, bread and fish together. Any comments or thoughts or questions about that section? All right, great. Okay, so let's go back to Matthew. Hold on, wait 1 second. Let's go back to Mark. Let's go to Mark 8, because there's a story here that I think we need to interject. I think this will be a good place. I'm confident this is a good place to put it. All right, so in Mark's account, right after they come across the sea, they do come into Bethsaida, and there is going to be a healing here of a blind man. But you'll notice as we're reading this, and you probably already noticed, that there's something unique about this account. So let's read 22 through 26. They came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to Jesus and pleaded with him to touch him. And taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village. And after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he was asking him, do you see anything? And he looked up and was saying, I see men, for I see them like trees walking around. Then again, he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored and began to see everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, do not even enter the village. All right, what's strange about this miracle? He healed him twice, or he healed him halfway, right? Or part of the way, 75%. I don't know what level men walking like trees is, but 80%. So he is able to see, right? But he's not able to see clearly. And also, I would say, we've seen Jesus do some spitting already, but here he's taking spit and putting it on his eyes. So that's something in addition to that. So he spits, he puts it on his eyes. So the man can see somewhat. He can see people walking, but I think it's like when you look at trees at a distance, you can't see any detail, and it's just a foggy kind of picture. And then Jesus lays hands on him again, and he can see everything clearly. All right, so maybe we should say, what do we know is not going on here? Maybe that's a bad question. What might somebody think if they saw Jesus and he tries it?
That he's not capable of it the first time.
That he's not capable of doing it the first time. Do we believe that's the case? I would say absolutely not. This is the only, so there's a couple of things about this. This is the only time we see a miracle worked in two steps like this. And it's only recorded in the Gospel of Mark. Right? I don't think that means Mark made it up, but I think Mark is including it for a specific reason. I think that's a helpful question to ask, as John tells us that the whole world couldn't contain all the things that Jesus did. So I think when we're reading a Bible story, especially a story about Jesus, I think saying, why this one? Why did Mark? I don't think that's a bad question to ask. Now, we may not have an answer for that, and that's okay. I don't have to be able to explain why the story's in there. But I think it's not unreasonable to say, why would Mark include this here when Matthew and Luke, who tell the same account, don't put this one in? So we'll think about that in a second. So the first thing I want to say is I don't think this is a situation, I know it's not a situation of Jesus not having the capacity to do it in the first instance. Anything else that might seem like a bad explanation?
It's like the way he's teaching the apostles. It's cloudy to them at first, and then it's going to become clear.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's going on in this account. I think it's what's going on for the disciples, and I think it's what's going on for readers of the book of Mark, and for all the Gospels. But I would say Mark makes this point more clearly. Chapters 1 through 8 of Mark have more miracles per chapter than any other section of the Gospels. Right? Mark has more miracles more than chapter than any of the other Gospels. It's short. It's got a lot packed in there. But almost all of those are loaded onto the front end. I think on the front end of the book of Mark, Jesus is trying to prove who he is. In the second section of Mark, we see way fewer miracles, but we see way more conversations about what's coming for Jesus and for his disciples. And I think that what we have, so chapters 1 through 8 of Mark, I would say we could define it as Jesus is the Christ. I would say chapters 9 through 16 of Mark are the Christ is going to a cross. And I think what we're going to see in what's coming up is that the disciples are committed to the idea that Jesus is the Christ, but they still have a very blurry idea of what that means. And what they're going to need to do is, just like this blind man, they're going to need to stick around a little bit longer to see the full picture. Does that make sense? I really think that Jesus is using this miracle as a picture lesson about where the disciples are and where they need to be. And if we are readers of the book of Mark, I think by the time we come to chapter 8, we should be saying, wow, he is the king. And I think that's what Peter is going to say in just a second. We'll look more carefully at that. So when Peter says Jesus is the king, he has ideas of what he means by that, but we're going to say Peter could see, but he could only see men walking like trees, right? When it came to who Jesus was, Peter could see, but he was seeing blurrily. And Jesus is going to say, Peter, you need a second touch. You need extra help in seeing what that really means. I think that's where this story fits in the book of Mark, and I think Mark is unique in that it's right in the middle of his book. So it's kind of you've got those two halves. And then Matthew and Luke don't have this miracle included, but I think it works just the same because the disciples are going to start getting information about what it means for Jesus to be the Christ, and they're going to have a tough time with it in Matthew and Luke as well, and we'll wrestle with that with them as we go. Anything else on that?
Just the fact that he took him out of the town to do it.
Yeah.
So we're starting to see that change too, where he's doing these things, but he's, instead of telling them to go tell, he's don't go back into the village. He tells the disciples later, don't tell people that I'm the Christ. He told the ones last week, don't go tell anybody, because I think he's trying to focus more on why he's here as far as the death instead of the miracle side of it.
Yeah,
he's still having compassion.
Yes.
He's still doing the things, but he's trying to calm the crowds.
Yeah, you can see that we are in periods of retirement, right? Even as Jesus is going to these locations, he's doing things to kind of withdraw himself from the crowd. That's absolutely right. Okay, anything else through verse 26 of this? All right, everybody good? All right, let's go back to Matthew. We could look at Mark. We could look at Luke's account. Either one would be just fine. But in Matthew's account, we get more detail. Well, I don't know that we get more detail, but putting it all together, Matthew is a good one to go to. All right, so do you want to read some of this? Take that, and then
Yeah, that's fine. So in verse 13 it says, Now when Jesus came to parts of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, Who do men say that the Son of Man is? And they said, Some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, But who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answered and said, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said to him, Blessed thou art, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I say unto thee, Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. I will give unto you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Then charged he the disciples that they should tell no man that he was the Christ. So, as we was talking about a while ago, some of what happened before, I think, kind of sparks this conversation. And so he asks, Well, who do people say that I am? And you get this answer of John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. And then he gets really personal with it and says, Well, who do y'all say that I am? And we see the famous saying by Peter that, you are the Son of God. And then the response there, you think, we talked about it a couple of weeks or last Wednesday night, do you think Peter, when he made this answer, could clearly see everything as we just talked about? No, like we just mentioned, he knew that Jesus, who he was, but he still didn't have the clear picture of what was going to happen. But like I said the other night, he knew he didn't know the answers, but he knew who had the answers. And, that application real quick for us today, we don't have to know everything. We don't have to have it all perfect, but we have to know who has the answers and be willing to seek those answers and submit ourselves to that authority. And I think we see that with Peter is he knew who Christ was, but he couldn't see the whole picture. And then the fact that, we're going to see the church here mentioned as far as upon that statement, I will build my house upon that rock. That's the church. What do you think, 19? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I'll come to verse 19 in just a second. Okay. So let me on our map. I'm a map guy. I like maps. So Caesarea Philippi, it's over here on this column over here. So if you ever need to locate Caesarea Philippi, okay. So this is Sea of Galilee. We're north of that. So we zoom in right here. It's going to be basically at the foot of Mount Hermon. We're going to talk about Mount Hermon, Lord willing, on Sunday evening. A lot of people think that's where the Transfiguration takes place. It was the tallest mountain in the area, and it would make sense given that in chapter 16 there at Caesarea Philippi. But anyway, so he's there. This is a picture from Brother Malden's website, and this is the reason I wanted to pause for a second to this. This is Caesarea Philippi, and this is a bedrock up here. And there were actually, you can see some of them kind of carved in. You see that right there? These little nooks cut into the rock side. And I don't know if that's just a cave or if somebody cut that or what. But there were nooks in this that were cut out for the worship of the Greek god Pan. Right? If you've ever seen the Disney version of Hercules, it's the little half goat, half man guy. He was half goat, half man anyway. But it's a very Danny DeVito, I think, is the voice behind him. Okay, so what I want to say is just from this conversation that's going on here, Jesus saying, upon this rock, I will build my church. Now, I don't think he's pointing to the Caesarea Philippi rock, but it would be a pretty good illustration of a rock, a bedrock to build on top of. And I think that helps me kind of paint this picture in my mind. So, Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus says that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. What's the false doctrine? I'm just going to assume that we all agree it's a false doctrine that springs from verse 18 with regards to Peter's confession. Do what? Was he the first pope, right? So why would somebody say that this would show that Peter's the first pope?
Because Peter is
build his church on it.
That's exactly right. So Peter means stone or rock. And so it's as if Jesus is saying, your name was Simon, I'm going to name you Rock, and upon this rock, I'm going to build my church. Now, it's not exactly like that, right? Because Peter and Petros, the word for rock, are different words, right? You have Peter, which is like a stone, and then you have rock, which is like a bedrock. What I would say about this is we need to put this, first of all, in context of what's happening, but also put it in light of other scripture. We need to have the whole weight of scripture testify to this. So first of all, Jesus is saying, upon this rock, I will build my church. What is he talking about if he's not talking about Peter?
The statement of the Son of God.
The statement that he's the Christ, the Son of the living God. I think that's exactly right. That's the confession upon which the church will be built. So when Jesus talks about building his church, I think sometimes people who draw the conclusion that Peter's the first pope, I think they think he's talking about building like the institutional structure of the church, and it's going to be rooted in Peter, built on Peter. What Jesus is talking about is the means by which he's going to gather his people, right? When he talks about building a church, it's the way we would talk about a coach building a team or a man building a family. It's about gathering people. And in this case, he's gathering a people on what basis? On the basis that he's the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's what's going to bring those people together. And in some cases, that might be the only thing that would unify them, right? Not race, not ethnicity, not amount of money, not location. The thing that would bring them together would be the confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now that takes us to verse 19, because people look at that and say this is additional information that says Peter is in fact the one that's going to be kind of the officer that's going to be able to determine entry. So he says, to you I'll give the keys of the kingdom of heaven, right? You get to determine who's in and out. And whatever you say on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And so people say, look, Peter is given this special authority that's not given to the other apostles. And so he has the right to speak. And then the Catholic tradition says that right to speak in that way is handed down, right? They build a lot of teaching off of this verse, right? To say that the Pope is the one who gets to determine the rules of what's bound and what's not bound. And that's how they have gone for the last 2,000 years, right? There's several things that I think are challenging to that. One is that Jesus does, in fact, say this same thing to all the apostles. Flip over to Matthew 18, and we'll come to this text later on, but it's helpful. And he's talking to all of the apostles, and he says, truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. That's exactly what he had told Peter in verse 19 of chapter 16, right? So it's not just Peter that's giving the rules about what's required and what's not required. It's all the apostles. And the other thing is the way that it's phrased here. It is not saying that Peter or all the apostles get to make the rules as they go. That's not what's happening. What's happening is that they are revealing the words as they are already established in heaven. All right? So the New American Standard, the translation I look at, which is an update of that, says this: whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. And I think that's a good rendering of that verb. What he's saying is, you are going to be the ambassadors for the will that is already decided in heaven. Right? Peter is not making that up as they go. The Pope doesn't get to take his knowledge and impose that on people. What's happening is the apostles were going to deliver God's will. So I think about this. I think about clean and unclean food laws. They would go to Jewish places and they would say, you don't have to listen to that anymore. How did they have the right to unbind that? How did they have the right to loose that? It had already been loosed in heaven. When they go and tell people, you must be baptized for the remission of sins, why do they have the right to bind that? Because it was already bound in heaven, right? So Peter was able to do that, and the other apostles were able to do that. He's not in a special pope role. He is in a special apostle role, and we don't want to miss that.
And maybe along
yeah.
with what you're talking about,
Yeah.
with the Gentiles.
Yes.
Peter's the one.
Oh, yes.
That's part of that.
Absolutely. So we do see Peter in some ways taking a special role. Acts 2, it's his sermon that's recorded. Acts 10, he's the one that goes to Cornelius. But I'll also say this, Acts 2, it's not just Peter preaching. It's all the apostles preaching, and we just have Peter's report. And in Acts 10, Peter will not be one of the primary ones to go to Gentiles. I think he will basically focus on the Jews, but he is kind of the first one to bridge that gap, at least for the time being. Okay, so
That's why God sent the Holy Spirit to the apostles.
that's exactly right. Yes,
Make no mistakes.
that's exactly right. Yes, and so for me, if somebody says, well, why do you approach the Bible the way you do? I think I would go to the book of Matthew, would be just a great place to kind of go. I'd say, here's the promise that Jesus made to Peter, and we can connect that to the other apostles, and then go to Matthew 28, 18 through 20, that the apostles were to go tell all things that I have commanded you. Well, why? Because whatever they bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatever they loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And that just builds this case of apostolic authority, right? So I'm listening to Peter and James and John and Paul, not because they just happened to live in the first century, but because they were the ambassadors that were sent out from the king. So I think this is a very, very helpful passage in that. Any questions with regards to this section right here? Okay, we talk about that section a whole lot, but it's very rich, and I think it does a good, so talk about a foundational passage right upon this rock. I feel like there's so much truth contained in that it can kind of serve as a bedrock for a lot of the things that we try to pursue and believe. I would put a lot here. Support other places. For example, the way I know Peter's not the rock is because in Ephesians chapter 2, it says Jesus Christ is the cornerstone upon the building on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. They don't make a distinction between Peter and the other apostles. Paul doesn't. And I think we'll see that. We'll see that throughout the scriptures. Okay. Any other thoughts?
Peter, or Jesus not wanting the disciples to publicly proclaim him as the Christ, is that for other people to draw their own conclusion, or is that to buy him time where, persecution doesn't hasten?
Yeah. I think maybe the persecution is part of it. I would say, I think in the immediate context, I think it very well may be their lack of understanding about what that means. So remember the feeding of the 5,000 in John's account. They want to take him by force and make him king. They're convinced he's the Christ too, but they have a misunderstanding of what that means. I think that Peter will show us he has a misunderstanding of what that means as well. And if he goes around spreading the news that Jesus is the Christ, well, what does that mean to Peter? It means the Romans are out of here and we're going to win the victory and all that. And I wonder if that may not be part of it. But I also think that it probably goes with this withdrawal period where he's trying to focus and kind of hone in on the disciples. But maybe because of a lack of understanding of what it means for him to be the Christ.
I think you see that in this next set of
right.
verses when he's talking about the things that he's going to face, and they're like, no,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to go through this. I mean, so.
Yeah, let's go ahead and read that section if y'all don't mind, verses 21 through 23. So there's three statements, and in all the synoptic gospels, when I say synoptic, I mean Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three of them repeat these three occasions. This is the first one that shows up. This is in Matthew chapter 16, verse 21 through 23. It's also in Mark 8, and it's also in Luke 9. This is going to be his first clear statement about his death. So this is verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised on the third day. Right? So we have this death, burial, and resurrection picture being painted. I do want to notice that word must. It's essential, right? Divine necessity is the weight of that word. Now, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on God's interest, but man's. So what had Peter just confessed Jesus to be? The Christ, the King, the Son of the living God. Then Jesus says, I must die, be buried, and be raised. And what does Peter say? No. Okay, so if I confess you as the King, and then you say something, if I say you're the Son of the living God, and then you say something and I say, yeah, but not that. That's not how it works, is it? When Peter makes a confession that Jesus is the Christ, that's total buy-in, right? That's total commitment to him. And so when Jesus says that these things are going to happen to him, one, I think Peter misses the resurrection part. I think he's focused on the death part. But not only that, but now he's opposing what Jesus says. And I think Jesus is saying this is an all or nothing kind of thing. You don't have the right to come to me and say I'm the king and then reject the plan that's here laid out. And I think that's true about all kinds of things, right? You'll see people with I Heart Jesus bumper stickers on their car, and then their lives, tell something different. And maybe that happens to us. We have Church of Christ on the side, or maybe we have Christian on as our label, and then our lives different than that. And my only point with all that is to say is that Peter has to learn that his submission to Christ is going to mean that he has to embrace a plan that he would not have anticipated for the Christ. That the way this Christ is going to be enthroned, the way this king is going to come to power, is going to be in a different way than Peter would have anticipated. Anything on those verses?
No.
The very last line there, you're not setting your mind on things of God, but things of man.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of epitomizes the apostles at this point.
Yes, I think you're right.
And the people for that.
Very much.
But they're, when he talks about leaven, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
we didn't bring you bread.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm talking about.
Yep, that's right. I think that's great. And I think this is a demonstration of the need for the second touch, right? I love that in Mark's account with the blind man. He sees, but not clearly. But if he'll stick around a little longer, we'll get some more clarification. This is Jesus providing that more clarification. And you can see Peter doesn't see it, but he's going to. Now, in the last paragraph, and we'll have to go a little bit quicker here. We're okay. We got time. But let me say this about the get behind me, Satan. What's going on there? What do you think? Adversary. So I don't know if Jesus is saying, Peter, you're Satan right now. The word Satan means adversary. So he was just in opposition to him. It may be that Jesus is saying, you are working as an agent of Satan right now. And the reason I would say that is because everything that was human in Jesus dreaded the cross, right? It was not something that was pleasant. I was reading through the beginning of John, and he's talking about my hour has come today. I was reading John 12:13, and my hour has come, and then his heart was troubled, right? We have them in the garden, and Father, not my will, but your will be done. He's struggling with it. And then for one of the disciples from the inner circle to say to Jesus, we'll never let that happen to you. You could almost see how that would appeal to the human side of Jesus, right? To the side of Jesus that would be opposed to going through all of that. Now, I say that just to say that I think there's two parts of that. One, maybe that's why there's such a stern reaction from Jesus. Right, you got to cut that off at the nub. We're not nip it in the bud. That's the word I was looking for. We got to cut that. We can't let that kind of thinking keep going. Did I say something?
No.
It was my
I said biscuits earlier.
Yeah,
So.
We had to knit that, but also because Peter's going to need a lot of clarification really quick. And I do want to go to these last few verses because Jesus is going to say, actually, Peter, it's even more than what you think, right? It's not just that I'm going to a cross that you have to accept, but it's even more intense than that. You want to take us through those last few verses? Whatever you want.
So in 24 it says, and Jesus said to his disciples, if any man would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whosoever shall save his life shall lose it, and whosoever shall lose his life for my sake shall find it. For what shall a man be profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his soul? or what shall man give in exchange for his life? For the Son of Man shall come in glory of his Father with his angels, shall he render unto every man according to his deeds. Verily I say unto you that there are some that stand here who shall in no wise taste of the death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. The thought there in 24 about denying himself, that's a pretty a big charge that we're going to find here, and that same charge is going to be given to us today, to deny ourselves, to deny our own wants and wishes, and to put God's things first, to put Jesus as the total control and authority in our life, and put our wants and wishes to the side. That was the same thing that the disciples was going to have to do, and that anybody that was going to follow Christ was going to have to do. And we see that kind of mentioned here. And then 26 to me is one of the most simplest but most powerful verses we find. If you gain the whole world and you lose your soul, you gain nothing. You profited nothing. And I think that's one of the most powerful lessons that we can learn is if we gain everything but we lose our soul, we've lost everything. And then 27, we see is that a foreshadow of judgment there, you think?
Yeah. So you see what I'm saying a minute ago when I said that Jesus is going to tell Peter that it goes even further than just Jesus going to a cross, right? He said, you're going to have to you're going to have to take up your cross too. There was a speaker when I was young and I heard him say, he could not have spelled out in terms any more plainly total commitment than using the phrase, take up your cross, right? You got to deny yourself and follow me. Well, to what extent? Even to the cross, right? Even if that's where it takes you. And that in verse 27, so what I think we've got here is we've got three explanations. Why in the world would I deny myself? Why would I take up a cross and follow him? Well, the first reason is because if you want to save your life, you'll lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake, you'll find it. That's why you would lay down your life for his. Because for, it means because of here. Because if you want to save your life, your physical life, your earthly life, if you want to do it your way, you're going to lose the real life that matters. For, what will it profit a man if you gain the whole world and lose your own soul? Nothing. What would you give in exchange for your soul? You would lose out on that trade. And then for, the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels and will then repay each one according to his deeds. I don't know if I have to. Yeah, I got a minute. Flip to Daniel 7. This kind of rings in my mind every time I read that phrase, Son of Man. And especially when it talks about the Son of Man coming in the glory of his Father. I think it is a preview of judgment because he talks about repaying each one according to his deeds. But I'm wondering if he's not pointing forward to enthronement first, about the status that he's going to have. So look at Daniel 7-13. Daniel says, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming, and he came up to the Ancient of Days and came near before him. Right? So here is the Son of Man coming into the glory of his Father, right? Coming into the presence of the Ancient of Days. And what happens? To him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and men of every tongue might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which will not be taken away, and his kingdom is one which shall not be destroyed. All right, so basically what Jesus is saying here is, I am about to come into my Father's presence, and I'm going to receive that kingdom that was promised in Daniel 7, and I'm going to repay to everyone according to his deeds. I think when the explanation here, this for, is because look at the status that I'm about to have. Look at the place where I'm about to sit. I'm about to sit on the throne. And so he explains in verse 28, in fact, truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. I think he's pointing forward to like Acts 2, when the kingdom is established and Jesus is on the throne and he rules. And there is going to be judgment that comes as a result of all of that. And so why would I deny myself, take up my cross, and follow him? Because if I try to save this life, I'm going to lose it. And because no matter what I gain in this life, it ain't worth it. And because he is sitting on the throne and he's going to be able to repay to each one according to his deeds. And the kingdom is coming. And I don't want to be on the opposite side of him, because here he says he'll pay according to his deeds. I think is it Mark's account or Luke's account where he says, and if you're ashamed of me, then I will be ashamed of you in the presence of my Father. And That's pretty powerful work. If the king is sitting on the throne next to the Father, the Ancient of Days, I don't want to be ashamed of him because he's sitting in the primary position, and I don't want him to be ashamed of me sitting right there. And so I think it's 3 levels of explanation. All right, we're out of time, I think. Anything else you want to say as we close out? These are some questions for Sunday night. If you want to look at those, just thought questions. They help give me a little bit of guidance of what direction to go to and all this. And we'll look at those passages then. If the verses here don't line up with the verses on the schedule, that's okay. The verses on the schedule cover it. I just wanted to make sure I got all the parallel accounts in it. So should be all right.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.